An essential requirement in the development of any oil, gas or mining project is the availability of finance. And this section deals with what that availability is and what the steps a company needs to take in order to satisfy the needs of the providers of finance. And that's essentially the same for both private sector and state ventures. The difference being that in the state case, very often there is competition with national budgets, which leads to a squeezing of the state, particularly state oil companies, which we addressed in an earlier section. The sizable extractive companies in either oil or gas draw on their own sources of finance, three main sources: cash from existing projects and retained earnings, bank borrowings against the corporate balance sheet, so against the whole company, or project finance specifically loaned against the capacity of that particular project. The aim would be normally to aim at 20 or 30% equity, so that's finance from the company itself, and the rest borrowed, project borrowed. In some cases, there is finance against forward sales of production, particularly when there are worries about the future commodity price. But in general, shareholders do not like companies to hedge forward their sales. They prefer to take the commodity price risk themselves. For a smaller company whose cash flow is restricted, they would have to and whose borrowing capacity is too small, they would have to look at other means of raising the capital. So they could sell additional shares in the parent company, the main company, a so-called rights issue, where you sell new shares in exchange for rights to the company and the project, probably a single project company. Of course, if the existing shareholders do not take up their rights, the existing shareholders, their share is diluted. An alternative would be to sell equity in the parent company to a major company and enter into a kind of alliance with a major company having a major or minor shareholding in the company, and perhaps bringing technology and credibility to the company. Decreasing the parent company shareholding at project level, you could do by other means. You could, for example, bring in a partner, a so-called farm-in partner, who, particularly if the project is not very well defined, could agree to fund the next phase of appraisal in exchange for an increasing share in the project, and then gradually build up a share and pay for much of the equity share of the project. So the desirable minimum size of a major company in either oil and gas or mining is really determined by the ability of that company to fund or lead the funding on its own of a world-scale project in that industry. And that in the mining industry would be $1 billion, $2 billion, maybe more. In the oil and gas industry, it would probably be in the 9, 10 billion or even more. So that is really the determinant of what the optimum size of a company is, where you can really do things on your own. Now, prior to making an investment decision, a company would have to have done a number of things. It would have had to drill enough wells to be certain that the reserves were there. It would probably have third-party appraisal of those reserves. So bring in an independent consultant to certify that they'd looked at the well data and so on. They would have undertaken a full site evaluation and ground condition surveys for any plant. They would have decided on what technology would be used and assessed the risks and the rewards of using new and perhaps less proven technology with a worry about cost overruns. They'd have carried out environmental, social, and nowadays a human rights impact. They'd have assessed the need for any infrastructure required to develop the project and talked to the government about integrating that infrastructure with any national plans or perhaps getting funding to help with the infrastructure, for example, construction of a port or a railway line or a pipeline. Importantly, they would have assessed the availability of skilled workforce locally or nationally, and any ethnic or religious complications that might be involved. They'd have considered the requirements for housing, medical and school facilities. Would there be accommodation for families in the area, or would you have to bring people in and out on shift? And they would, of course, have acquired the necessary government's permits and or received assurances for the permits and worked with local communities, including indigenous people, to make sure that employment opportunities were described. They'd managed expectations, they'd consulted on those expectations, they'd made commitments on future benefits, established, very importantly, governance mechanisms for the community and the relations between the community and the company, and taken the necessary steps to acquire what's known as full, prior and informed consent. Now, in parallel with all of those technical things and environmental things, there would be successive financial evaluations. So you have to bring the technical, social, governmental together with the finance and arrive at a kind of landing. In that process, you would have in your evaluation a range of price scenarios for the product. What were the likely future directions? You'd probably have 2 or 3 different price assumptions, high, low, and medium. And these would, the financial calculations would increase with precision over time. You would evaluate any possible demand constraints. Would there be, what are the export possibilities? Fundamentally, the likely position of the project on the global cash curve. And also fundamentally, the ranking of this project, which might be highly commercial, against other projects in the company's portfolio, which might be more attractive, and what the availability and constraints of capital are. You'd also take into account the current and possible future tax changes and the need for any long-term off-take agreements for the product. Now, apart from all those things, you would be looking at the need and desirability of having a partner. Do you need a local partner? Would it be good to have a state government or state-owned partner, a company of another nationality, or even a state-owned company of another nationality, perceived perhaps to have influence in that country? Or to partner with something like the International Finance Corporation of the World Bank, which again would give the project credibility as a commercial partner. The robustness of the project to future government change is extremely important. If you have a transparent, fair, and ethical agreement, it will be likely to survive any change of government. If the deal is fair, it will survive. So it's extremely important to do due diligence. If you're going into a venture, perhaps another company, a smaller company, has acquired an interest, developed a project, you need to look very carefully at what was involved in that. If If you want to get an idea of that, if you Google Guinea and iron ore, you will see what can happen if you don't look more carefully into what went on, or may have gone on, before you became involved in the project. And that would give you an interesting example, I think. You also have to consider the impact on your company of international perceptions of the government and possible charges of complicity with the government if the government behaves in a way, for example, may offend against universal human rights in another area of the country, nothing to do with your project. What is the company's responsibility and attitude to that? And fundamentally, relationships with civil society organizations, both international and local. So this process of project development is an ongoing one, bringing together all of these things. The financial close on the project is the final investment decision is only likely to be achieved when the main construction contract has been bid and is ready to award, where the supply contracts have been tendered, final bids received and assessed. In the case of a major LNG gas project, for example, you would have gas supply agreements, a construction contract, project financing agreement, a commitment to shipping, perhaps to have arranged the shipping, and the long-term sales with the customer. All of these would come together very often, and do come together, in a kind of magical witching moment with teleconferences around the world, everyone with their pens poised when they sign it finally. Construction would start, dividends would probably not flow for 8 or 10 years, but in the case of liquefied natural gas plants, there are many who've been through this process and resulted in streams of income to mutual benefit of companies, nations, and so on. Thank you very much.